Chinese writings on bamboo and wooden slips relevant to Old Chinese phonology date from the late 5th century to the mid-3rd century BC. Our interest in the Warring States writings as relatively new sources of data for the Old Chinese phonology mainly concerns the component structures of characters in the early Chinese script, which are sometimes different from the received standard. So, for instance, in the Qin orthography, for the word wen, meaning here, well-known, ask, you have the semantic ear and the phonetic door. And in Chu and elsewhere, the character has ear and the man as the phonetic. Here are some more examples, famous examples. The pre-imperial Qin regional orthography, which is basically the direct ancestor of the modern standard orthography, is represented by two different bodies of materials. One is the Qin manuscripts from the Warring States period, and the other is the Qin dynasty's small seal script, as recorded in the Shuowen Jiezi, 100 CE. The two are in different calligraphic styles. The Qin manuscripts is in what is called the Old Clerical script, which is quite similar to Han Dynasty's clerical script. And the Qin Dynasty's seal script is closer in style to the mid-Warring States period Chu manuscripts than to the Qin and Han clerical scripts. So the seal script used during the Qin dynasty was a traditional and somewhat archaicized calligraphic style that was normally reserved for inscription texts. Skip this slide. But using orthographic variants as new facts about Old Chinese phonology is complicated by many issues. One of the issues is that currently there are quite many different proposals of Old Chinese reconstructions which significantly affect the way those previously unknown characters are interpreted. And since almost all issues raised since Li Fangui are still being debated, we can say that we have some 5-6 competing reconstruction systems. There are many points that researchers of Old Chinese today generally agree on. For instance, there's a distinction between labiovelar and velar and post-velar initials. We have a set of voiceless nasals, and there are two liquids. Each of them had a voiceless counterpart. Medial R takes care of the connection between division 1 and division 2 rhymes of Middle Chinese. And the velar and post-velar initials are closely connected. Shao Rongfen in 1991 established that the voiced velar or laryngeal fricative R have two origins. One of them goes back with the G, and the other one goes back with the palatal glide. So two origins, one velar stop and the other maybe a uvular stop. And Old Chinese had consonant clusters. Yes, we're sure of this fact, just this much, but what are the forms and functions of the clusters? And we agree on the morphological function of the Middle Chinese Chu tone at the Old Chinese stage. We agree on the voicing distinction of Middle Chinese is a morphological function at the Old Chinese stage. On the other hand, researchers still debate on many issues that make the phonetic shapes of reconstructed Old Chinese words very different across systems. Many of these issues involve methodological assumptions that are unlikely to be solved through newly discovered materials, unfortunately. So these are some of the issues. Whether to reconstruct voiceless stop initials, endings, or voice stop codas for the Middle Chinese open syllables, which have all sorts of context with Middle Chinese voiceless stop. endings, so-called inru duizhuan. Whether or not to reconstruct a rounded nuclear vowel for subgroups of traditional yuan and wan and ge rhymes. And what is the phonetic distinction between type A and type B syllables? And what are the forms and functions of consonant clusters? Should we reconstruct valency increasing S or valency decreasing N? And how exactly to reconstruct the coda R for those yin-yang, so-called yin-yang duizhuan cases? And what is the conditioning factor or factors for palatalization of Old Chinese velar and post-velar initials? And what is the phonetic distinction between Chongnyu third and fourth division words in Old Chinese as well as Middle Chinese? And so, there are theoretical issues that we cannot quite solve through discovered materials. And also, researchers disagree on which graphic variants make meaningful new information for Old Chinese, and precisely what kind of meaning to make out of those character forms when they do not agree on how Old Chinese words should be reconstructed in the first place. So here is an example that everybody talks about. The Chu script and elsewhere has this phonetic men, for one. And the received Qin standard, it's also confirmed in Qin manuscript. The phonetic is the door, men. And one interpretation is that men is older and was replaced by mun because of the loss, the neutralization of the rounded vowel. So this is a piece of evidence that supports the rounded vowel hypothesis. Another interpretation is that when you don't necessarily accept the rounded vowel hypothesis, these two are perfectly interchangeable, functionally equal phonetics. Just looking at the archaeological findings, it's hard to confirm actually the mun is older. Mun appears in many different regions, whereas mun appears only in Qin region, but they're more or less contemporaneous. Previously, the hun wasn't written like hun exactly. It was a different graph. One side was an icon. I'm sorry to call it icon because that graph did not survive in the writing system, so we don't know the function, we don't know the meaning, but it's quite graphic. It's a man listening, obviously. And there's the other component that is clearly this ear, and here. And in later Warring States period, mid-Warring States period, we start to see this form, mun, with a different phonetic. This character went through a kind of irregular historical development, which Liu Zhao described as 变形音化. A graph changes the shape to become a phonetic. A graphic component in a character gradually changes shape to eventually overlap with a distinct graph that is effective as a phonetic component for a word that the character stands for. So if the change from the earlier form hun took place in the 5th century or later, it means that the voiceless hun still existed at that time. So this character is important for the date of voiceless nasal hun, not for the rhyme part. That may be another interpretation. That's just to make the point that you can make all meanings out of this one graph, depending on what you think about Old Chinese in the first place. Here's another example. Fu, the word for skin, fu, has the apparent phonetic hu, back initial, but the Old Chinese or Middle Chinese has a labial initial. And in manuscripts, we have a graphic variance that represents the labial initial. and how are we going to interpret this case. One interpretation might be that it's the two sound changes in two different dialects. The K back initial remains as back initial in the mainstream Old Chinese, but it can change to P in another dialect, and that the P variant got borrowed into the mainstream Old Chinese, and that became the standard. And another interpretation is the prefix P attached to K. Actually, I didn't see in Baxter Saga that they used this prefix to interpret the skin, but this may be a possibility if you already have PK and KP alternating as clusters. Differences of interpretation influenced by differences in competing Old Chinese systems are further complicated by the fact that researchers have introduced some new methodological assumptions to apply to manuscripts and not to transmitted sources. One of the assumptions is that the orthography of the manuscripts from the Chu region of the Warring States period is based on the Chu regional dialect of that period. But apparently the Shuowenjie was not supposed to represent the Qin dialect of the Qin dynasty. Another new assumption is that the phonetic elements in the characters in the pre-Qin script represent syllable types rather than the pronunciation or syllables of particular words. Of course, every graph has a syllable value, but what's significant in this new assumption is that all graphs that have the same syllable type value are not just interchangeable, but that they should be found interchanging for the same word. This view suggests that there was such a fundamental change in the way that Chinese words were written down between the pre-Qin period to post-Qin dynasty period. In my view, the change from the Warring States to Qin dynasty was not in how free the phonetic selection was, but who was the authority to decide which forms are correct for which words. Having explained some complications about using manuscripts as new data, I would like to explain some principles that I have in mind when I interpret the characters. There are 3 points to discuss. The first concerns the phonological periods and dialects represented by manuscripts and the orthography in them. The second is on the principle of phonetic representation in the Chinese writing system, and the third is on the vowel system of Old Chinese. By the first two, I do not intend to suggest any new principle at all. On the contrary, I would like to reconfirm some assumptions that sustained the many Old Chinese reconstruction systems proposed so far. First, in any given body of excavated early Chinese writings, we can reasonably expect the following some four layers of phonological systems. One layer is the mainstream Old Chinese, and the second layer is loanwords borrowed into mainstream Old Chinese. These words pronunciations from different phonological systems, these are word pronunciations from different systems, phonological systems. But once they are borrowed into the mainstream Old Chinese, they are at the lexical level, not the phonological level. So they may be used as synonyms along with their cognates in Old Chinese, or they may displace the original Old Chinese words, mainstream Old Chinese words. And the third and fourth layers are the standard phonology and dialects of the time when the manuscripts were copied. The Chinese writing system is a logographic writing system. It's not a syllabary. A phonetic graphic component in a character has a phonetic value, it always does, but it must be associated with a particular word or word family. A phonetic is read once it is chosen for a character and therefore for a word. It is read as a pronunciation of certain words that which it is chosen to represent, and it's not just syllables. The number of distinct graphs in the logographic writing system is comparable with the number of words in the lexicon rather than kinds of phonological units. So what does a word mean in Chinese? A word means a morpheme. A morpheme may be a root syllable with or without a loosely attached prefix or half a syllable. And individual words as lexical items do not always correspond to separate etymons. The identities of lexical items are indicated by differentiations of character forms, and such relations between words and characters change over time and place. In modern standard Chinese, the word ya, as in meng ya, is distinguished from ya, as in ya chi, but they may be one and the same word from etymological point of view. Carlin said that. And Guangyun Middle Chinese, we have these three lexical items: zhi support, zhi branch, and zhi limbs, and they are homophonous, che. From etymological point of view, they may be one and the same word. And there's another item that is written as duo, many plus zhi, and the meaning is many. And it has a second reading as che, that's falling tone. It's a chuto derivative which is not distinguished graphically from their morphological variants. So in a hypothetical warring states script, this is a warring state style. So ya, meng ya, the ya is the root, this graph that represent the root, and you add grass and you get sprout, the character, proper character for sprout. And if the semantic is not specified, it means that back tooth. The true branch, you add the tree, and it means branch, that proper character for branch, that word branch. And it may be a graphic variant of chu plus flesh, which means limbs. It's also a graphic variant of chu plus duo, many, and so on. So the selection of a phonetic component is arbitrary in the Chinese writing system. A second and a third selection may occur in different regions with or without phonological motivation. Each phonetic component is arbitrarily chosen, but once it's chosen, it has to be a property of that particular word and word family and shouldn't be altered so readily. So what am I getting at? So there's this word an, and the Middle Chinese initial is glottal stop or zero. The zero is normally reconstructed as Q, or it doesn't matter, just it's reconstructed as some sort of post-velar initial. But if it just happens that this phonetic series an contains only glottal stop, nothing else, should we suspect that it made its own phonemic class? Q and Q, G and K and G can interchange, but the Chinese logographic writing system does not require these three separate phonemes to actually interchange. And is it important that an is used to transcribe Alexander in the Shiji? So the transcription sources are not as important as the more general principle mentioned just now, but we incidentally know that the old Sino-Korean transcription uses this word an to describe K, to transcribe K. So the Q is more likely than the glottal stop. But this counterexample is not important as long as we start with the assumption that the Chinese writing system is a logographic system, not a syllabary. I prefer to reconstruct WA for those cases suspected as rounded vowels because it is difficult to establish the distinction between kon and kwan. I do not deny the fact that TW vowel and dental ending and T vowel and dental ending, the kaiko hoko distinction is strictly observed in Xiesheng and rhyme. But the problem is that we cannot tell the difference between kon and kwan through Shijing rhyme. We cannot use Xiesheng evidence or word family cognate relations because K and T will not make connections in those areas anyway. So the only possible evidence is the Shijing rhymes, and we cannot confirm that such a distinction existed. So why do we not see the distinction in the Shijing? We may have these explanations. Just ambiguous, we don't have enough data. And the change from U to Wa seems to have occurred quite early in some parts of the Shijing. And the text was edited in Han times, and there are irregular rhymes and so on. But what if the distinction never existed? So this may be an alternative interpretation. Ke, wo, a, an sounds like kwan. And it's phonemically kwan because ku is natural. So we get the initial ku and an. And kwan will contrast with kan in Xiesheng series and word family relations. On the other hand, te, wu, a, an sounds like tuan and ton, and phonemically it doesn't matter whether it's analyzed as ton or tuan because it won't rhyme with tan anyway. So it's interesting to compare the W with medial R. The Old Chinese dental initials followed by medial R becomes retroflex initials in Middle Chinese. In the case of KR, the retroflexion does not occur because ker is not natural. So when the ker does not occur, that R may affect the vocal part more significantly. So that's how in some modern dialects, the Chongnyo third division vowel turns out as rounded, whereas the same effect, the same result did not happen with the dental initials. So there are many complications in using manuscripts, but once we have an Old Chinese reconstruction system and principles that are consistent with the ones underlying the system, then it's possible to sort out those phonological layers in manuscript materials on the basis of what we already know about Old Chinese. I'm going to suggest that these two phonetics originally stood for the same syllable value. And the value was like prar with the R coda. The first graph, ba, is identified with the standard ban, and there's no significant orthographic difference between this true graph and the received, and is synonymous with bay, also meaning riverbank, slope, and slanting. Bay and ban are synonyms. And in true manuscripts, or also in the seal script, the two phonetics look quite similar. But originally, the B didn't look like ban. Originally, it had two components, as Carl Green identified. It had hide and hands, two components that didn't look like B. So what happened was that because they are created separately to stand for the same syllable, and of course they would write the members of the same word family. So they came to evolve to look more and more like each other. So that's what we got in the warring stage script. So with this supposition, we can revise the Old Chinese reconstruction forms of these words. Oh yes, Baxter and Sagar identified the change from R to I as a feature of Shandong Qi dialect. And Qi dialect had some prestige in the ancient Chinese world. And there's this line: suppose there is a high elite of Chu who wishes his son to speak the Qi language. Should he hire a native of Qi to tutor him, or a native of Chu to tutor him? So on this supposition, we revise the reconstruction like this. Bar became ban, and bar became pi, and then bay. So at stage 1, they were cognates, and at stage 2, they were synonyms because one was borrowed into the other variety. And Baxter and Sagar has this word ban per verse. And we have many words with the other phonetic that has similar meanings. Basically, slanting, partial, one-sided, insincere, oblique, slope, walk lane, lean to one side, slanting, oblique, partial, and so on and so forth. So another example. There are two phonetics alternating for the same word, di, round. Ta and ye were not distinguished in the early script. They were one and the same graph. And so there were two variants, not three actually, in the early script for this word. Ta and ye, the other one, the first one is preserved in Chu and Qin scripts, and the other one, tuan, is preserved in Jin script. So what this means is that di, the word for di, ground, had R ending, and then it evolved to J ending, open ending. So in this case, the Qi dialect variety got borrowed into the mainstream, and then it replaced the normal one, the mainstream one, which would be N ending. So in these two examples, we identified two kinds of dialect variation: the W insertion or deletion, or rounding or unrounding. If you use the rounded vowel hypothesis, we don't lose much if you choose either hypothesis. And an and I came from earlier R. The dialect borrowings in mainstream Old Chinese increased synonyms in the lexicon and influenced graphic evolution. Thank you very much for your attention.